Welcome to the Federal webinar. We have with us a very distinguished panel of guests, and I will come to that a little later. But we are really going to discuss something that's enthralled the world or kept the world on tenterhooks, which is the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Last year, almost exactly a year, on Feb 24th, 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. If anyone had even suggested that it would go on for 1 year and continuing, people, there would not have been many takers for such a view or a prognosis. But then, as it turns out, we've had this war continuing for 1 year at various degrees of intensity. And it's not just been a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It has larger geopolitical ramifications. It's also in many ways had an impact on the rest of the world. It's turned into a very layered kind of a conflict. And we have with us a very, as I said before, a very distinguished panel of guests. Two of them are former ambassadors and been in the Indian Foreign Service. And we have one more, Dr. Singh, who's been a very, very well-known and distinguished academic. So let's start with, before I, set the ball rolling, I'd just like to briefly introduce all of them to you. Dr. Swaran Singh is currently visiting professor, University of British Columbia, Vancouver campus. He's also professor at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and president of the Association of Asia Scholars and adjunct fellow at the Chahar Institute in Beijing. He's also a senior fellow, Institute of National Security Studies, Sri Lanka, and a visiting professor at the Yunnan University of Economic and Finance, China. So he's got a handful of things which he does. I don't know how he manages it, but then, well, he's doing it. And then on top of it, he has some, wonderful set of books that he's written on internationalism and multilateralism. So it's, great to have you, sir, Dr. Singh. And then you also have, we have Veena Sikri, a very experienced IFS product, and who's also straddled academia and diplomacy. She has served for the last 37 years, from 1971 to 2008, as a career diplomat with the Indian Foreign Service, including as High Commissioner to Bangladesh, Malaysia, and as Consul General in Hong Kong. She has held challenging and prestigious assignments, among other places, at the Indian Embassy in Moscow. So that's going to really bring in a personal element to this discussion, I presume. After retiring from the Indian Foreign Service, Veena Sikri joined academia as professor at the Academy of International Studies, Jamia Millia Islamia University in New Delhi. So that's what Veena Sikri is. And then she also has to accredit a number of books, which I think one must definitely take a look. And then the third and, another very, very, very important person in the Indian Foreign Service, Rajiv Bhatia. He's also been in the Foreign Service for 37 years. He served as ambassador to Myanmar and Mexico, and as High Commissioner to Kenya, South Africa, and Lesotho. He's a prolific columnist and also a regular speaker on foreign policy and diplomacy in India and abroad. He was Senior Visiting Research Fellow during 2011 to 13 at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Singapore. And Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia is a Distinguished Fellow Foreign Studies Program at Gateway House. So, well, when I said we have a distinguished panel, I meant it, and then you saw it now. So what, this issue, this conflict between Russia, Ukraine, I just want your opening remarks on where it's heading. We can start with Veena Sikri, ma'am.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Dakshinamurthy. It's a wonderful idea for the Federal to have convened this webinar. It's a very important issue. There's a great deal of interest across India and I would say across the world about it. So I thank you for convening, and I thank you particularly for inviting me to join. It's a great honor. Um, when you say that we're going to talk about the conflict where it is now, I would like, if you don't mind, to begin with India's position, because I think that India's position has emerged globally as a unique position. And I think it's worth looking at both from what it has meant for India and what it could mean going ahead for the end of the conflict, for how it could pan out. I think India's position, first of all, has been defined by two very significant aspects. From the very first day, India has focused on the need for dialogue and diplomacy and a cessation of hostilities. From the very first day, they have not even, wasted a second on anything except dialogue and diplomacy and end to the conflict. So India's peacemaking role, peacekeeping interests have been at the foremost, and this has been important and well recognized by the world. Secondly, this focus immediately on a resolution of the conflict has highlighted India's foreign policy of strategic autonomy. And I think this aspect of the need for strategic autonomy in foreign policy has been a message very well received by all players in the conflict and by the rest of the world. I think this is a very important aspect. The second, I would say, the second phase of what India has been taking a very active role is our Prime Minister has been in touch with President Zelensky of Ukraine and with President Putin of Russia. They've had numerous telephonic conversations and with President Putin, even meetings. And Prime Minister Modi's remark, considered view expressed to President Putin that this is not an era of war, has also another aspect that has taken the attention of the world and focused once again on the need for cessation of hostilities, dialogue, and diplomacy. Now, I'm saying this for another very significant reason. I think that India's focus on strategic autonomy and on finding the way of a solution is vital for in the success of India's presidency of the G20. And I think this is an important connect to make, because throughout this year, India has the presidency of the G20. In a few days, we're going to have the foreign ministers meeting of the G20, and in September, the summit meeting. And of course, in between, a large numbering 200 or so of other meetings. And I myself have participated in one or two of them. So I think that India's position on, and I've seen myself when I was in that G20 working group side event, that, this has given India a real boost in its stature globally and has focused the world's attention on the need for a solution. I think this is absolutely vital. Together with this, we have seen that a food crisis emerging because of the massive contribution of Ukraine and Russia to the wheat supplies of the world. We've seen a fuel crisis emerging, the energy prices going up, energy crisis, and so food, fuel, and energy, the three crises. And each of these, India has also played a significant role. Immediately on the food crisis, we have opened up our reserve stocks of wheat and sent them to countries like Egypt, which were in real urgent need of such, and to many other countries as well. And this has been another factor that has India's role not only in peacekeeping, but in keeping supply chains open. Critical supply chains open, like food, fuel, and energy. And India's purchase of oil from Russia has, of course, been a question of much discussion all over the world. But I think now it has been such a well-accepted factor that yesterday or day before, the German ambassador in New Delhi, speaking on the eve of Chancellor Scholz's visit to New Delhi coming up in the next day or two, he has said, it's none of our business where India buys its oil. So this has kind of put the lid on the entire controversy. The world is now willing to accept that, what India did, not only in follow-up of strategic autonomy, but in other factors, has played a very major role. I think that, all the situation, this is what India has done. But let me point to one factor of the global situation, which is very important. And then I'll come a few words on the actual. the global financial situation. The
Ma'am,
global.
ma'am, we'll come to this point about the
Okay.
financial situation, and then as we discuss.
So can I just mention one last point before I just give up?
Sure.
I'd like to mention here that while we're talking about the situation in Ukraine and the conflict, how it goes ahead, I think we have to take two factors into account. One, I would like to say the run-up to the conflict, which includes the Minsk agreements of 2014, how they were not implemented deliberately, as indicated by many people, including former Chancellor Merkel. The second point I'd like to focus on in subsequent discussions is public opinion. I think this is going to play a very big role, because while we have seen this conflict has brought together the transatlantic members, the US and the EU are now firmly together in the saddle, coordinating in every way. What is the public opinion in these countries saying? Is there conflict fatigue? Is there war fatigue? Are the people thinking that inflation and availability of goods is more important? Jobs is much more important. We don't want a world recession because of this conflict. And is this public opinion going to play a role in the early conclusion of the conflict? These are some of the questions I'd like to raise, and I'll come back to all these later.
So, thank you. Thank you, sir. Mr. Bhatia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Murthy. It's an honor to be here.
Thank
You
you.
have very kindly given me 5 minutes for the opening remarks, but I want to assure you that I'll only take 4.5 minutes because I only have 4 or 5 broad points to make at this stage.
Yeah.
Let me take up the question you raised with Veena earlier. Where is this war heading?
Yeah.
The answer is actually very simple. Nobody knows. Nobody knows as to how long this war would last, whether it would expand, what eventual effects it would have, and what would be the end game. So let us be very humble and recognize nobody knows where this war is heading. What we know is as to where this war is coming from.
Okay.
And you were absolutely on the dot when you said right in the beginning that a year back, nobody really had seriously written or predicted as to how the outcome would unfold as far as this war is concerned. There is a famous maxim that we all know as the students of international relations, and it says, you can start a war, but you cannot control its trajectory and its outcome. This maxim applies entirely to the Ukraine war. Now, my second essential point is as to what is this war? Is it just a military conflict between Ukraine and Russia, which began once Russian troops invaded Ukraine? No, it is not that only. It is very much also a NATO-Russia confrontation in all its glory and in all its dimensions. And therefore, you have a situation where it is one country, a major power, a former superpower, juxtaposed against the world's most powerful military alliance led by the US. Is that only? No, it is not that only. I think we also have to recognize that it has international ramifications, as you yourself pointed out right in the beginning. Yeah. There is an Asia connection to the conflict. Japan is very much supportive and sympathetic of the Western stance. There is China, which is far more closely aligned to Russia. And then there is India, which, as my dear friend and colleague pointed out, Veena, India has a more complex and nuanced approach on this issue. And therefore, there is very clearly an Asian angle. There is also West Asian angle, oil and the rest of it. I'm sure we'll go into that. But above all, there is a global South angle. This came out very sharply at the recent Global South Summit, which India hosted in January. It became clear that Ukraine-Russia military conflict is impacting on the rest of the world. However, I would like to submit, rejecting all the portrayals by the Indian media channels, this is not a case of the world at war. The world is not at war. This is not the Third World War. It is essentially an intra-European contestation that is going on, in which obviously the other poles of power are getting engaged in one form or the other. My next point, keeping in mind and look at the clock very much, is that who has won so far? I think it is true to say that Russia lost by not winning outright. And it is also true to say that Ukraine won by not losing outright in the beginning. When those 150,000 troops of Russians with their tanks were marching around on the Ukraine-Russia border, the world thought of previous similar show of power and thought that it was a matter of days, if not hours, for the Russian army to come and control Kyiv and impose a regime friendly to Moscow. That was the picture presented by the media. It did not happen. And by the same token, I think if anybody thought that Kyiv was just waiting to really hit Russia very hard and wound it, even that did not happen. So clearly, it has been a year of surprises, of hardship to people, hardship also to the people of the world. And therefore, without highlighting the India aspect at this stage, I would conclude by saying that this is the number one geopolitical event and development of the past year, and probably it will stay that way in course of this year as well.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Singh.
First of all, let me join my senior panelists, co-panelists here in thanking you, Dakshinamurthy, and your team of the Federal Premium to invite me to become part of this discussion. Where is this conflict going is the first question all of us are trying to understand. Wars, as an academic, I see can move in multiple directions. They could escalate or they could terminate, they could stalemate, they could move into, kickstarts of a fatigue kind of up, on again, off again. My broad guess would be that at this stage, completing 1 year, where you're seeing lots of discussions are happening on what have been learned and where it is going, I want to say that it is perhaps going towards escalation of the multiple possibilities that we can notice. And that is clearly visible from multiple things that are happening around us. For example, yesterday and today, General Assembly is debating on one more resolution on Ukraine, and on Friday there's a ministerial meeting of UN Security Council. But if you have followed how UN organs have addressed these issues, it's only divisiveness that has come forth. And indeed, we have understood that as long as there is at least one party to conflict which holds a veto power, UN has shown virtually, inability or become dysfunctional in this case. Now that clearly leaves the onus on major powers to, find a way outside United Nations. And what are these major powers doing? We again heard two very interesting speeches on Tuesday morning and Tuesday evening, one in Moscow, other is in Warsaw. And you heard both sides trying to ratchet up rather than, calm down and cool down the kind of enrage that we notice on the ground. President Putin, once again alluded to nuclear threat. He's decided to suspend the New START treaty that was signed for another 5 years in 2001. And indeed also said that, his, side is completely ready for one, or many more nuclear tests in case United States does similar things. But we also understand that this grandstanding or brandishing of nuclear threats at such high frequency actually erodes the credibility of that threat over a period of time. And how the other side is responding is also equally grandstanding posturing that we notice. Among several other things of calling him an autocrat, and he's now facing the strong American willpower and so on. Interesting revelation of President Biden's speech from Warsaw. In fact, Warsaw city was to say he has now clubbed together about 50 countries coalition that are going to supply weapons to Ukraine to continue standing against Russia. And of course, also the fact that they are now moving forward and planning to start supplying offensive weapons, main battle tanks to Ukraine. So in that sense, it doesn't look like moving towards termination or accommodation or even stalemate. I think it's clearly moving towards escalation. And that tells us how something that President Putin likes to say, when you have major powers deciding the trajectories and tenor of a conflict, the first thing, any local conflict becomes a global conflict immediately. So it's a tussle between two big powers that, we see decimation on the ground is no longer the focus. Hundreds of thousands of people have died, millions have moved out of Ukraine all over, and I have lots of them in Vancouver where I speak from. So that becomes a secondary issue in that sense. And I think when you look at these leaders, both President Putin and Biden are going into their domestic general elections. So is actually Ukraine and indeed India as well. And sometimes these domestic, I think, compulsions again begin to impact upon how they wish to at least articulate. And many times some of these things become largely lip services and showcasing of their own individual personalities, focus on legacies. And that the main issue where the conflict begins to get marginalized over a period of time. So let me close by saying my initial comment would be that I think the conflict is not going to disappear in a hurry, is where I see conflict going. But what I see increasingly happening is that the epicenter of the conflict and the misery of people there is over a period of time going to become less central to global debates than I think the geopolitics of major powers.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. In fact, taking off from what you're saying and what Mr. Bhatia was telling us, the war is escalating. And then, what we're also seeing is a kind of a shift. It was the Russians Putin thought it's going to be a walkover when he invaded because the previous Georgia experience in 2008. But then it's not turned out the way he had possibly calculated. Now, the point here is that there has been a pushback from Ukraine thanks to all the support it has received from the US and European countries. And we are seeing a situation where there's a kind of a stalemate and, Putin probably may be on the back foot. So the point is now, if Putin realizes that it's going to get worse for him and for Russia, will he resort to a desperate move and where rational thinking might be sacrificed, say for something like a nuclear option? Is there that kind of a danger? Do you foresee, Mr. Bhatia?
Actually. In all humility, I think this question should be addressed to Veena ji because she served in Moscow. But since you've asked me, I'll only give a one-line answer, which is that all our Russian friends and experts make it clear that Russia has enormous power and strength and also a great deal of wisdom in that polity. So this typical Western portrayal of a mad Putin ready to use nuclear weapons has to be taken with a pinch of salt.
Yeah.
Ma'am, what's your...
I broadly agree with Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia. I think that one thing is, we talk about press and free media and knowing what's happening everywhere, but the world has cut itself off from news about Moscow. The world has completely, because it's a complete clampdown on media reporting from Moscow, on even an airing of views of what is it. And I'm telling you that, again, if public opinion were aired everywhere, you'd find a solution much quicker. And I agree with Ambassador Bhatia also that, President Putin is constrained definitely not by his own strength, because he has enough of that. And I think there are enough reports. And I would say that, this announcement by President Putin that he's going to suspend participation in New START has worried the West a bit. But again, I would like to focus on something else that's happening within Russia. And that is, in the beginning, there was opposition to the war from within Russia. One has to remember that, the Ukrainian-Russian connections are civilizational. I mean, they are the same people, essentially, especially the people of Ukraine living east of the Dnieper River. They are definitely Slavic, and they are definitely people who have intermarried and have very close civilizational links with the people of Russia. The people living left of the west of the Dnieper River, they are Catholic. They were Polish to begin with. A part of Poland was put in with here, and other countries around, have lost territory. So it's a different composition altogether. So certainly in the beginning, President Putin faced a lot of opposition, but over the months, seeing the kind of existential threat that has been posed to Russia by this constant pressure from the EU, US combined, by putting in now the tanks and maybe jet aircraft to come, longer range missiles to come. So it has become a US Russia almost direct confrontation, because it is known that many of the missiles, etc., that are already there with Ukraine are being operated by Western operators. It is known that. So the conflict is becoming much more direct, and people in Russia are feeling that existential threat. And with that, the support for Putin has grown. Okay. So he is now more confident because he has internal support. And once you have internal support, and we've seen from previous occasions in history when, Russia has been invaded and there has been this concerted internal support, then the pushback becomes much stronger. It has been much stronger. So the pushback is going to be there. So this is the question, I think, what Professor Swaran Singh said about escalation. This is a very important point. The push today is for escalation. And if you are going to go for escalation, there is no escape from World War III. But I think, number one, that you have to, at this point, again, I come to the fact that the global South is united against escalation. And I think the economy of the US, the de-dollarization that is happening in other parts of the world, the bilateral trade agreements going on, the rupee-ruble payment and so many others, you see, okay, let's do it bilaterally and so on and so forth. All kinds of new financial payment agreements are coming into force.
Lose your voice, I think.
Sorry. So I think that because of this, the dangers of escalation have to be looked at very seriously. And I think that the view of the Global South, I think the Global South Summit, as Ambassador Bhatia mentioned, is very important. What they said, as we're going to see during the G20 meetings under India's presidency, the Troika is today for the first time is from the Global South. You have Indonesia, India, and Brazil. So that's another important factor. So can they bring it?
We'll come to that.
So I think that we have to look at the importance of what Russia is doing and cool down feelings, cool down. Diplomacy, dialogue, please, let's look at that. We're looking at a resolution. We do know that, the president's office in Ukraine spoke to Ajit Doval about the 10-point Ukrainian plan, but we have to look at the factors that happened before. As I said, the Minsk agreements, the US-Ukraine Charter on Strategic Cooperation. So,
Mr. Murthy, I have a question really for Professor Swaran Singh to just make it a bit more fascinating. I would simply, in 2 sentences, like to contest Professor Singh's thesis that we are heading for an escalation. I have been talking to my friends in Kyiv. The situation is very different there now. A lot of those people who had fled have come back. Economy has picked up. Hospitals are working. Railways are working. Not too many missiles are being rained on the major cities. The fight is only in the border area, and there too it is a pure stalemate. Someday Ukrainians won, the other times Russians win. So in light of that, through you, with your permission, I want to ask, are you sure we are heading for an escalation? Because the moment you say that, Mr. Murthy says, oh, is there going to be a nuclear holocaust?
Because I feel that danger is somewhere there in the back of the mind, I feel that in the past, Mr. Swaran, Dr. Singh,
Thank you. I'm so delighted that Ambassador Bhatia chose to ask me a question. It's an honor to me to try to respond to him. 2 things. One, why I said I see escalation rather than termination. I put that in binary mode. And that it's not moving towards termination, it is moving towards escalation. And why I said so is simply because the whole West uniting now to begin supplying counter-strike or offensive weapons, not just defense technologies, defensive technologies. And to main battle tanks, I heard Ambassador Sikri adding even aircraft, fighter aircraft. I'm sure she has a good, sort of access to knowledge in terms of from where that indication is becoming a possibility. So yes, in that sense, it's going to move towards escalation. I am aware of the fact that initial great strides that Russia had made, that has shrunk over a period of time as much as by half, as I'm told. So yes, Russia's initial grand plans of, in November itself, launching a draft treaty, asking United States and NATO to give written security guarantees, and sending a former President Viktor to Belarus to, reach Kyiv, and they are going to change Zelensky and he's going to take over in a matter of 2 weeks. That is no longer happening. So where President Putin has now, over time of, over period of time has compromised, is now focusing on 4 regions that in September 30th, accession treaties he signed with these 4 representatives from there. He says these 4 regions belong to me now. So that, of course, is definitely true. But to answer your second and more important question about nuclear escalation, and there is no confusion on that, because if you read the speech given on Tuesday, State of the Nation speech by President Putin, 2-hour-long speech, he's answered this question himself, that nuclear threat is not aimed at Ukraine. He's clearly said that. So that clearly means that is aimed at containing NATO, and it has worked. NATO has ensured that they do not get to be seen as getting into the conflict directly themselves. Now, what is adding to that thread, again, I mentioned earlier losing credibility because of repeated mentions. This Monday, again, Russia had tested one nuclear-capable MIRV actually missile, intercontinental ballistic missile, which actually the test failed. And now that would otherwise would have matched with President Biden's visit to Kyiv, but it kind of boomeranged. So both in terms of articulation of nuclear threat is not aimed at Ukraine, and of course this failure of the ballistic missile test is an indication that I don't think need to look at that seriously, but I know if you look at madman theory, yes, the only worst case scenario is tactical nuclear weapon in eastern part of the Dnipro River. And those are weapons built in 1950s and 60s. Nobody was making after that. And those are rudimentary weapons. And I think to response to that from West will continue to be still conventional, because my contention again is that this is emerging to be now an issue for major powers geopolitics, where Ukraine is nothing but a battlefield to satisfy their egos.
Yeah. If I may come in,
Sure.
I'd like to say, yes, you're right. It is clearly Ukraine is now a plaything. I mean, their economy stands destroyed. That's fine. We're not going to talk about Ukraine. But the threat of sending aircraft and longer range missiles and more sophisticated tanks is not only escalatory, but it puts pressure on Russia. So as I was talking of the existential threat to Russia, Putin is going to have the support of his people in the use of nuclear weapons if it comes to the crunch. And the other factor, you mentioned about the ICBM failed test, the other factor is China. Now, China, America has been working very hard to bring China, with the trying to do the friendship with China, the meetings with Xi Jinping and Biden and so on, to show that China remains a so-called neutral posture. But that's all gone. Wang Yi is meeting Putin in Moscow yesterday, today. I don't know whether he's still there or he's left. It's clearly a consultation for the future. So the possibility of China coming in directly, whatever it's doing now, it's already obviously sending some assistance to Russia, but coming in more directly with the bigger factors, and including ICBMs, etc., that's to be seen. So I think the escalation push makes the question of World War III much more imminent. So that is the question. We have to avoid the escalation. So again, we come back to the possibility of some kind of a dialogue and diplomacy moving towards peace. Let's see what happens in that UNGA resolution, which is now being discussed with, Ukraine is so keen on. But, we also saw that on the eve of Chancellor Schulz's visit to India, one of the points that German ambassador made yesterday was that, yes, India is definitely in a very important place as part of the peace.
Yeah, we'll come to that.
But we're not now, exactly. So I think that this question of what Putin will do will depend very much on the escalation that Dr. Swaran Singh spoke about, how real that becomes and how the conflict between USA and Russia becomes real time.
Yeah, I want to bring in Mr. Bhatia on this, the impact of this conflict on the world. And we already seen that it's heading towards what is, a possible recession. There's the food shortages. Then you also have uncertainty over the oil supply. So even if it doesn't escalate, even if it continues at a medium intensity, and it just continues that way, on paper, the conflict is still on, though it's not fully resolved either way. Neither does it escalate, but it's not resolved. So where does that leave the rest of the world?
Thank you very much. First of all, I think my thinking would be closer to what you have just described as the likely outcome in the next 6 months at least. I think we are essentially talking of continuation of the war. It probably will be a low-key affair. The actual fighting would remain confined to the border area, the Donbas region. Ukraine will not be able to go and capture Russian territory, and other European countries will not intervene in terms of sending their troops. So we are looking at continuation and fairly controlled continuation at that. On the second part, I think it's very clear the triple F crisis, food, fertilizers, and fuel, have hit everybody hard. But I think we should look beyond that, and we must recognize that the world has learned to live with the ill impact of Ukraine. The world has not collapsed. The international economy has not gone down. And India, for example, is a bright example. Others also, even in Africa and Latin America, for them, it's quite a distant conflict. And they, in any case, are used, particularly in Africa, to deprivation and shortages. So in a way, there is a certain degree of philosophical resignation and acceptance, and also essentially a gratitude that it has actually not turned into a European conflagration in terms of becoming World War III. There's no question of that. So I think that is fine. And yet there are other important priorities for the world which are demanding the attention of the world leadership. And we know all of them. There is the climate change challenge. There is the energy crisis. The pandemic has not gone away yet. And above all, there is the overarching challenge of bringing faster, more inclusive, better economic development, particularly in the underdeveloped parts of the world. So Ukraine has sapped energy and attention of the world chancelleries from that agenda. And we hope that this year will probably see some redressal, provided Professor Singh is wrong and others are right.
Dr. Singh,
I'll be really happy to be wrong on that. I'll be happy to be proven wrong on the subject.
Yeah, I just bring us to this question of India. Ma'am has spoken a bit about it, but really, if you look at India and its foreign policy, India has managed to straddle both Russia and the US sides. Okay, quite successfully. So, procuring oil from Russia and then, reselling it to Europe. But within this, what I see is that there is also an element of, let go by the West, because it's also convenient for them, because they are also getting oil from somewhere. Because there is the real issue is, if you really clamp down on Russian oil, it's going to be really tough. So this way, there is a kind of a leak, a known leak, an accepted leak that happens, and India is benefiting from it. It's more a de facto benefit rather than an aggressive or a conscious recognition of India's power in the world. I mean, so how do you react to this, Dr. Singh?
That question is to me.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think India has used Ukraine war in converting a challenge into an opportunity, I would say. And this has become a kind of a case of India, becoming far more assertive in pursuing its own national interest and showcasing that it has perspectives that are not necessarily in line with the major powers. So whether it is United States or Russia, both of them are slightly uncomfortable with what India is saying. And India has pursued what I call proactive neutrality in the conflict, which works at two levels: constantly engaging at the apex level with the national leaders to ensure that the damage can be mitigated. They come to the talking table and somehow the ceasefire is signed, but not waiting until these actors begin to connect with each other, supplying humanitarian assistance irrespective of the shape and size and tenor of the speeches from both sides. So that has put India in a very different light around the world. And, really some kind of acceptance and now recognition of India's perspective on Ukraine. And same applies to even neighboring Afghanistan, again, where India has continuously supplied humanitarian assistance while not recognizing the Taliban government or, accepting the way things are running in Kabul. So that kind of has brought in a new chapter, I would say, or at least an inflection point in India's foreign policy, and has raised India's stature. It is coincident that India this year is also chairing the G20 and SCO summits. Now, G20 is world's most powerful, sort of body right now. 6 of the 9 nuclear weapon powers, top 15 defense spenders are there. Of course, the top 20 economies are all there. And of course, the huge emerging India and China sitting there together. That, of course, will also be a challenge for India to make sure that all of them can come together. As Ambassador Bhatia was mentioning before the discussion began, Lavrov is coming for the foreign ministers meeting. We don't know if President Putin will be coming for the summit meeting and what that means for other leaders joining. So India has major stakes in bringing some kind of respite in Ukraine. And final very quick point, as an academic, I think there is also then not just India, but increasing space for what is now begin to be called emerging economies or middle powers. And now these are all getting clubbed together, whether it is Turkey or it is Iran or India, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil. They all are reflecting some kind of broad bandwidth of their understanding of how to engage with Ukraine conflict. And they are not towing the line of either Russia or United States. Now, Turkey has already shown us that it can, really influence Russia, and at some stage, grain from Ukraine had started going out with understanding that those ships will not be attacked. And thanks to Turkey, Turkey has been more active in that. India's prime ministers, that one phrase that Ambassador Sikri mentioned, this era is not era of war. At least half a dozen global leaders have repeated that phrase in their speeches. This was part of the Bali summit's final declaration. And that again, brings in certain focus on what India can do in terms of resolving this conflict. So I think there is an opportunity here for India. And I think not me and many others have said that the Ukraine conflict would be an opportunity for India.
I'll take your response forward to ma'am. I would, say that there has not really been, India has played, its foreign policy has been by and large independent right through. It's not that there has been a dramatic change in its policy. It always attempted, even during the Cold War and later, though it was allied with the Soviet Union, it always straddled both in many ways, because it's not that India was cut off from the West and it was with these, it never happened that way. And there have been many instances, and I'm sure, in your 37 years of experience in the IFS, you would have seen India play an independent role. So it would, I would say that how India is, its current position as far as this Ukraine conflict is concerned is a continuity. And it, of course, there is a modification depending on the specifics. But in principle, so I would say it is the same. So would you agree?
Of course, you're right. Yes, because this concept, earlier we used to call it non-alignment, and India is a founding father of the non-aligned movement together, Nehru, Nasser, and Tito. So this concept of, not being a camp follower, this is India's civilizational heritage, I would say, that we are not civilizationally camp followers. We don't just blindly follow one camp or the other. We debate, we discuss, we come to a conclusion. We see what is in India's best interest, and then come. So this is familiar for us, and definitely in that sense, it's a continuation. But at the same time, I think one must recognize that when exactly a year ago, when this conflict started, when Russia's what they define as special military operations in response to whatever had happened, the US-Ukraine Charter and the Minsk agreements, this was a very critical moment. And it could have gone either way. And this moment came in the middle of India's discussions as a Quad leader. Summits were being held on Quad, India's focus on the Indo-Pacific, the American focus on the Indo-Pacific, certainly, similarly, Australia and Japan. So here were Australia, Japan, India, and the US moving closer together, finding their feet on things they could do together, looking at the threat from China, seeing how to work on it, the maritime aspect. These were intensive movements. And in the middle of all that, India decided to continue with its policy of strategic autonomy. That was an inflection point that we decided to continue with that, Otherwise, in the normal course, yes, we are continuing with the Quad and we have to, so we no, we can't change. It was a very big decision-making point, and India had to take this quick decision and has carried it through. And the support that we have got from the global South, and this is one of the big disappointing factors for the US, that true, they have the US-EU joint, front, totally sewn up, totally, stitched together, as it were. But for the rest of the world, they're not there. They haven't been able to get the support of many other countries in the world, the emerging economies and others. And people have followed the lead of India on the strategic autonomy aspect. So this was definitely, number one, the decision taken at that inflection point, and then carrying through with it. And then making it into an opportunity, as Dr. Swaran Singh said, that we have made it into an opportunity, and we're carrying it forward into our presidency of the G20, and I'm sure in the SCO presidency as well, which is a concurrent presidency, and doing it in the benefit of India's own economy and our own people. So one is the global leadership, one is the leadership of the South, following the principles of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and the other is in the interest of your own people. We're attracting foreign investment. We've got the PLI initiatives, incentives for foreign investors, and we've got people investing in a big way. iPhones are now being made in India and sold abroad. Number of other, the computer chips industries are coming to India in a big way. So this has been a fallout which is very, very important for India. Now, of course, a lot of investment is moving from China to India. Now, this is because foreign investors find that India's middle of the path approach is far more stable. It's a stable approach and less prone to being affected by sudden, catastrophic influences all across the world, or conflicts and so on, which may escalate, which may remain where they are. So this way out for the world, for India, has shown a leadership path, which I hope through the G20 presidency we can continue to build on, which will lead us to great.
Mr. Bhatia, in fact, I would put the same question to you about the continuity in foreign policy and the difference now, or if there is a difference here.
Thank you. That's a very broad question, but let me answer it in the context of Ukraine, because after all, that is the central thrust. I would urge a slightly alternative view to look at this, and I would like to inject some realism into this scenario making. I think undoubtedly India's foreign policy is in safe and good hands. New Delhi has read the world properly. It is executing a number of strokes properly. So we have no difficulty with that. But I think we should not overstress what India can do on Ukraine. I think neither through G20 nor through the collaboration with 2 or 3 other like-minded countries, there is a possibility for India to do much. And for this, I have the authority of the foreign minister himself, who said back in September that the possibility of India doing mediation is premature. I don't think the situation has changed since then. I think India has been doing two very clear things. One, to protect and insulate its G20 presidency from the impact of Ukraine. So far, it has been successful, but two critical tests lie ahead: the foreign ministers meeting in March, and then eventually the summit. I think if in both cases we are able to get all 20 people in the same room, talking to each other in a peaceful, civil manner, that would be regarded already a yardstick for success of India. As to the actual mediation and helping in terms of finding the path for peace, never mind the famous sentence which has been uttered by everybody, which is very good for our mood and our health and our reputation. Does India have leverage as a potential mediator with Moscow and with Kyiv? The answer is that probably yes, but very, very limited. Does India have leverage on this kind of issues with the European Union, NATO, the US? Again, skepticism prevails over optimism. So I would simply conclude by saying that India is studying Ukraine scenarios very, very carefully and closely, but also realistically. The chances of India doing something dramatic, either under the G20 presidency flag or in collaboration with like-minded countries like either the Troika of G20 or France, Turkey, one or two other countries, Indonesia, all that is in the realm of all of us, the academics and the former diplomats.
Yeah, if I may just quickly, I think that India is not in the process of looking for the role of an active mediator. They're not actively looking for the role at all. I fully agree with Ambassador Bhatia that what EM said was very realistic. And if you see what the German ambassador said yesterday, he said not now. So it's not that India is looking for the role. It's rather that other people are talking about India having the role. But that is, for me, that is more a reflection of the respect that they're giving to India for the role it has maintained so far. It's not that, they're going to say, okay, now you come on, do this. And I know the role of mediators are very difficult. And not only that, you get browbeaten by everybody, and then ultimately nobody. I'm not at all talking about India's mediatory role, but what following this path of strategic autonomy has brought to India. I think that is something on which India can build upon for the benefit of its own people and for its position in the world.
I would put the same question to Dr. Singh a little differently. Is India acting from a position of strength or from a position of, necessity?
We are sitting with two very senior diplomats. Foreign policy is always a combination of leverages and limitations, and that's what diplomats do. They maximize their leverages and minimize the limitations through the communication paradigm and engagement bargaining. So definitely, yes, as Ambassador Sikri mentioned, there are several others who are underlining the potential. And I think German foreign minister was most recent in saying that, given the presidency of G20, maybe India has some leverages in looking at the Ukraine issue. I understand, like most nations, Indian leaders will be modest in saying that we have very limited leverages on that. As an academic, I can say, yes, there are limited leverages, but very high stakes now in ensuring some kind of thaw, some kind of pause button. Because minus that, I don't see a scenario where, as Ambassador Bhatia mentioned, having all the 19 other national leaders sitting around the table in New Delhi in September. That would be a huge challenge. And to make that as a success, the stakes that India has now in ensuring some kind of, I don't know what to say, that we all agreed this conflict is not going away very quickly. Now, whether that will be a pause or a thaw or a temporary lowering down of tempers or simple fatigue on both sides that will make it possible to de-escalate violence, at least briefly during that period, something has to be done. So let me just conclude by saying, yes, limited leverages, but increasingly high stakes in ensuring some kind of mitigation so that India can have a fantastic, successful G20 summit?
Thank you. I think we have really run out of time. It's been a great panel, and I'm so glad that all of you could find time to come for the discussion. This discussion is going to, of course, continue, and I hope you keep yourself free for our invite anytime.
Certainly.
Thank you so much, and
Thank
please
you.
Thank you. It's been
and also,
very
please use your expertise. You can, we would like you to write for us and be associated with. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank
With
you.
pleasure. Thank you very much. It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Bye-bye,
Thank you.
dear colleagues.
Bye. Bye. Bye.